Hi everyone, my name is Aled Davis, founder of mediatoracademy.com, home of the hungry and passionate mediator, and a place where new and aspiring mediators come and listen to experienced mediators share their hard-earned knowledge, expertise and strategies, all the things that have helped them become effective mediators and build a successful mediation practice. I get very excited about these interviews. I find them inspiring, I find them motivating. They encourage me to stretch my comfort zones. They encourage me to say things differently, do things differently. And I hope you'll be inspired too, so that you can go out into the world, create your own little success story, stretch your own comfort zones, and maybe come back here on Mediator Academy and tell your story to my audience. A hotly debated topic in mediation in the UK is about how the field of mediation in the UK makes room for up-and-coming mediators. This is based on data that suggests roughly 90% of all commercial mediations in the UK are carried out by around 5 to 10% of mediators. These mediators are by and large well established and have been around since the dawn of time. The dawn of mediation in the UK. I want to turn that question on its head and explore with my guest how newcomers can carve their own path in the field of mediation. Now, I also think mediators, we create some of our own problems as well. We learn a process, some skills, and then put that into practice time and time again. But is that really what clients want? Do we churn out the same old processes and the same old techniques, and by doing so leave parties feeling less than satisfied at the end of the process? Or should we be looking to innovate, be creative, get interested in what parties want and design a process that really meets their needs? Lots to think about, so let me welcome my guest. He's widely regarded as one of the most accomplished top-rank mediators in the market. He's been full-time in this field for over 20 years and has a thriving mediation practice. The Legal 500 have him down as one of the best in the field. He was for 11 years Executive Director of CEDA, and he's worked with some of the major ADR organisations across the globe. Before becoming a mediator, he practiced as a solicitor in the UK and Paris, handling international and domestic corporate and commercial matters. He's the founder and director of Conflict Management International, a leading private consulting firm advising businesses and governments on the effective handling and resolution of conflicts and disputes. He's been a mediation advisor for the governments of Russia, Slovakia, Turkey, just to name a few. Look, I don't know where to start. His mediation CV is one of the most impressive I've seen. And the worst part about it, he's a bloody nice guy. Bill Marsh, welcome.
Thank you. I'm not sure what to say with that introduction. I'll get you back one of these days, Aled.
Bill, I got to say, I was reading your mediation CV and it read like the 007 of mediators. And I've got to be honest, if I had a CV like you, if I had a CV at all, I'd want it to read just like yours. Really impressive. But I don't have a CV like yours because I'm just a newcomer and the mediation field just won't make room for me. But that's another story. We'll come on to that in a moment. But Bill, before we get into that, I'm interested in finding out what are the sort of notable changes you've seen in the field of mediation since when you first got started right up until today. What stands out? What are the major changes?
Gosh, there are lots of them, Aled. I mean, when I think back to the beginning of the 1990s, when I started in this field, the real debate wasn't should we choose this mediator or that mediator. The real debate was, what is mediation? Should we choose it at all? What does this process offer? How does it work? And so on. So there was an intellectual debate to be had and to be won, frankly, in order for the process itself to have any credibility. And I think it's probably fair to say that to some extent it was the blind leading the blind, because If you're going to start somewhere, you're going to have people who haven't got much experience of it. So those were the challenges then. I think obviously as time's gone by, it's become more recognised. It's become more trusted as a process. It's become more widespread. It's become more a part of the system, so the court system and the contractual systems and so on. And that's a huge strength because it encourages people to use it and so on. It's also to some extent a weakness because I think just as the process has become systematized, so it can become slightly neutered or a bit bland, and there's a danger of just reproducing the same old thing. And you touched on it in your earlier remarks. And I think in a way the broader acceptance of mediation carries both that upside and that downside.
Yeah,
and that I think is one of the big challenges now for everyone involved in mediation to be saying, how do we take this forward? In other words, who's responsible for pushing the boundaries? And I think to a large extent, those of us who are mediators and care about this field are responsible for pushing back the boundaries, doing some of the thinking, and seeing where else and how else we can work.
I think the topic of regulating mediation is interesting, and I guess one of the concerns I have around regulation is that are we trying to, as you say, systemize something that just doesn't want to be or can't be systemized, because it takes away it almost depersonalizes the process.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's the whole subject of regulation is a sort of perennial one and a bit of a perennial nightmare in a sense. And it depends very much whose hat you're wearing. I think if I was government, Ministry of Justice, possibly judiciary, then I would look upon it probably differently to how I look, because I would see the need for some kind of structure. Speaking as a mediator, which is the hat I do wear primarily, I've got real concerns about regulating. But I think I don't think it's one of those areas where we can just put our heads in the sand and say, well, it's all too complicated. Mediators shouldn't be regulated. We just should be left to our own inspiration, and so leave us be. Because if that doesn't seem to me to be appropriate for the needs of all the players in the field, and that includes the client base and the governments and judiciary and so on as well.
Yeah, and I hope hopefully we're going to come on to this, but thinking about actually who should we be listening to when we are thinking about how we take this field forward? Should we be listening to mediators, or should we be listening to those that will be directly impacted as a result of entering into a mediation process, so namely, clients and so on?
Yeah. Well, it's both and, isn't it? It must be. I think there is a lot of understanding and wisdom in the mediator community, and that should be accessed.
Yeah.
But I think, just as when I was practicing as a lawyer, that it was very clear that this was a service industry, if you like, and there are people we are serving. I think exactly the same is true in mediation. In the end, we are here to serve people.
Yeah.
And so it is not enough just to say we think this, that, and the other. The needs and the wishes and the perspectives of those we serve need to be understood.
Yeah. So one of the big changes is no longer you weren't debating which mediator should we choose, but should we choose mediation at all? Whereas now is the debate which mediator should we choose, or which of the top 5% of mediators should we choose?
Well, I mean, I guess you'll have to ask the clients that question, because I only know what comes to me.
Yeah.
But there is a common perception, and I suspect it's true, and you quoted some statistics earlier, about the proportion of commercial cases that are done by a very small proportion of mediators. So I think realistically that's true, and I think from what I understand it's true in pretty much every country.
Yeah.
It's an issue.
And I suppose it's the nature of the product as well. It's an inelastic product. I'm not necessarily competing with a particular let's say, the top tier of mediators, for those cases, nor are they competing with me for my kind of cases. They charge astronomically different levels of fees according to what I read, compared to the fees that I charge. So we'll never compete for the same work. But it doesn't necessarily mean that difference in fees reflects the difference in capability.
Not the slightest. Yeah.
But it might do in my case. But so I think part of it's the nature of the product. But before we go down this track, coming back to the sort of things that you've the changes that you've noticed over the last 20 or so years in this field, from a personal perspective, how do you think you've changed, either in the way that you practice or in the way that you see the world? What changes have you experienced?
Well, I mean, I guess my starting point is to say I hope I have changed, because if I haven't, then I'm doing something wrong, frankly. I think I'm more confident as a mediator. I think I'm less fazed by conflict. I'm just happy to hang around in the middle of conflict and see what happens, really. And sometimes, in a way, rightly, sometimes we seek to focus very intently and almost microscopically on skills, and I think those are important. But I think just one's presence in the context of a conflict itself, if you're prepared to be there and sort of deal with what comes up, I just think one's presence there, it's can be extraordinarily powerful, even if you don't open your mouth, and even if you're not particularly refined in the skills so much, but just the fact of being there, being what I think in some contexts is called the non-anxious presence.
Okay. And would you say that's something then that comes with experience, or is that something that, what type of experience?
I think the non-anxious bit comes with experience. I remember doing my first ever commercial mediation, and really, when I look back on it, I'm not sure I had any idea what was going on. I think it sort of happened around me. The fact that the parties ended up signing a bit of paper at the end that said they'd agreed was, well, I'm not sure how much credit I want to take for that. Because it was new to me, and I was pedaling like fury just to try and keep up with what was going on.
Yeah.
So I think that's that's changed a lot. I think my willingness to experiment has changed. I think my willingness to say to the parties, do you know what, I don't really know what we should do at this point, is greater. Uh-huh. I think it would get a bit disconcerting if you said it every hour or so, but to be prepared from time to time to say, this is a tough situation that you find yourselves in, and I'm not sure what the answer is. We need to talk through what possible answers there might be, what possible options for how we deal with this process. Yeah. So a willingness not to bring in, or not to think rather that I could bring in all the answers, I think has been a change. I think a sense particularly that mediation is not an amount of time, it's a process. And if you happen to get to the end of any pre-allocated amount of time, 1 day, 2 days, whatever it is, which frankly is largely arbitrary, if you happen to get to the end of that amount of time and you haven't reached wherever you hope to reach, for example, a settlement, for me that's neither here nor there. That just means we've run out of time. The question is not, has the time run out, but has the process reached its natural conclusion? And so I think I'm much more willing to say to people, look, I don't think, we've been here, 1, 2 days, we've done X and Y and Z. It seems to me that the next step would be to do A and B. What do you think? And to take more, in a sense, possibly to take slightly more leadership in at least pointing to some ways forward, even if they choose not to go there.
Okay. So something that I don't think you said, but I think you were referring to around being able to say, look, I'm not sure where we go next. It's almost being that real level of comfort with uncertainty. I think most people don't like uncertainty and get anxious around uncertainty, but being able to be still and be that kind of calm in the storm when there's uncertainty.
Yeah, look, I think that's part of it, and I think part of it is what it is you think you're there for as a mediator. And I don't think I'm there to solve all their problems. I think I'm there to primarily to give them an opportunity to have the best possible kind of discussions and process that they and I together are capable of.
Yeah.
And I think if you feel you're doing that, then in a sense you can sit more likely to the outcome, because you know you're giving it your best shot, you know you're doing everything you can. And so I think that's enabled me to sit more likely to the outcome. Having said that, I mean, I think it's absolutely true and probably right that parties still judge mediators a lot by reference to their perceptions of success, which is not just, was it an effective process, but did we get an outcome that we wanted?
Yeah. Tell me, do you say, I mean, a moment ago you kind of described, you said, depends what you're there for. If you're there to get an outcome or get a settlement, then that's one way. But you're there to give them the best possible chance of reaching an outcome. I mean, in terms of how you conduct your mediations, again, compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago, what are the things that you say differently in those?
It's a really interesting question, Alec, because I think we convey a huge amount in the choice of language. I mean, for example, it would horrify me, actually, if I heard a mediator talk about win-win. Not because it isn't in the books, we've all read that stuff, but actually in doing so you're creating a set of expectations that are probably extremely difficult to meet. So you're making a rod for your own back, and you're making the parties think that they will have failed if they don't find a fairy tale solution. Now, why would you set up a standard for the parties that is higher than realistic, or higher than maybe realistic, in order to ensure that they fail by it? I'd much rather acknowledge the difficulties at the start, acknowledge the difficulties of the situation they find themselves in, acknowledge the extent to which they differ in their views about everything, and so on, so that everybody is very clear about the challenge, rather than creating some kind of fairy tale expectation. So I think a lot of our choice of language, albeit unwittingly, sets expectations on the part of parties and those who are there at mediation.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations about setting expectations. You talked about time frame. Is the expectation that we're concluded by 5 p.m. or and how do we have those conversations with the parties beforehand to manage their expectations, not set unrealistic outcomes? And there was something else that you said just a moment ago about the language that we use, and that's it. It sounded to me as if you were kind of wheeling the elephant into the room. Rather than creating this kind of fairy tale win-win. Look, here's the reality. It's this is your perspective. This is your perspective. They're incompatible as they stand. It's going to be challenged. It's going to be difficult. So you're kind of putting all the undiscussable issues on the table. Which is creating a. I mean, how do parties react when you do that typically?
I've never had any pushback to it. I mean, I think actually I find on the whole, well, either they hate it and they're not telling me. It's possible, I suppose, or as I suspect is what's going on, they quite welcome somebody just telling it how it is.
Right.
Because there's no. If you don't do that, in a sense, the rest of the discussions are based on a false premise. I'd much rather acknowledge the realities of it from the start, but I think there's a both and to this, not an either or. I think acknowledging the difficulties is and the reality of their situation is part of it, and I think the other part of it is the sense of hope and encouragement that our language, as well as what we do, does bring. So I don't think it's about minimizing the problem. I think it's about being clear about the problem, but also being clear that in one's own experience that those issues needn't necessarily be a bar to them finding some kind of way forward. And I often say to parties that what I really want is for them to make some good settlement decisions. And if those are good in the sense that they're informed as clearly as possible, by as fulsome an understanding as possible of the situation, and they're good in the sense that they are motivated by things that they want to be motivated by, then and if they choose not to settle, well, so be it. But at least what they've got is an opportunity to make some really good, informed, thought-through settlement decisions. And that, I think, is probably the essence of our responsibility as mediators.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you pay a lot of attention to the words. You talked about choice of language. How much conscious effort have you put into choosing appropriate words, expressions, or not saying inappropriate words or expressions? I
think it's probably one of those things that we all develop naturally over time without necessarily giving it too much thought. But I have played back to myself sometimes some of the things I say, some of the language I use, and occasionally I've played it back to other people. I've played it back to my teenage kids, to my wife, and to other friends, and say to them, how would it sound if you heard this? Does that put you off? Does it inspire? Does it encourage you? What does that do to you? So, and I don't do it much, but very occasionally I've road tested some of these things against someone else. But I think again, one has to be careful of sounding too what's the word? Too planned, because I think what people relate to, apart from anything else, is authenticity.
Yeah.
And integrity, and they want to have a serious discussion with a mediator about how they see life in this particular context, and they don't want to be on the receiving end of a set of pat phrases.
Yeah.
I find people genuinely want to engage with another person.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah.
And I think they're entitled to have that expectation. I think that's part of what we offer.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking now, I'm thinking actually we're segueing naturally into the second part of the second question rather than the first question. But again, I'm seeing lots of overlaps because I'm thinking, one of the things I'm concerned about is mediators. They go through a 5-day workshop, a couple of days assessment, maybe a bit of reading beforehand, reading after, a few master classes, advanced training or whatever. Maybe very little opportunity to shadow. And again, that shadowing mediators raises an interesting question in that, to what extent is the approach being modelled effectively?
Yeah.
But that's another question. But and I know myself. I mean, on the very first commercial mediation I did, I think I'd rehearsed pretty much verbatim what I was going to say in my opening statement, and a bit like, and I could really relate to you reflecting back on your first mediation. I mean, it was just I just remember perspiring. Yeah,
I've been there. Got the
stressed, totally stressed out, worried about lots of other things, and not present at all.
Yeah.
In fact, I was the least calm person in the room, and that concerns me. And I think, I don't.
I suspect we've all done that, Alid.
No, I know, sure, and I hopefully I've moved on a little bit since then. but yeah, I'm wondering how equipped newcomers feel, new mediators, aspiring mediators, how equipped they feel to be effective in their first few mediations, but to be, if you're having a conversation with a potential client or a potential customer, how congruent you can be about the value that you can bring if you haven't had that experience. I mean, what you're talking about is espoused theory.
Yes.
Because I could espouse a lot of stuff about mediation, and then I'm sitting in the fire, and it all goes out the window, and I'm just trying to put flames out all over the place.
Yeah. I think it's natural when you start anything new. Very close childhood friend of mine is a doctor now. He's a leading heart consultant, but he did his when he was training. He did his first liver biopsy, the first one he'd done on his own, and the patient was on the operating table under a local, not a general anaesthetic, and the patient said to the doctor, my close friend. He said, "Doctor, I'm very nervous about this." To which my good friend said, "You're nervous. This is my first one." So there's a reality about this stuff that you've just got to do it for the first time. You've got to do it. You've got to make mistakes. You don't stop making mistakes just because you've done it longer. You hope that you make fewer mistakes. You hope that your judgment calls are better. But I don't think that being a good mediator is about not doing things that don't work, because you're going to we all constantly try things. Some of them work, some of them don't. It's about recovering the position effectively. If you've gone down a cul-de-sac that isn't working, being able to recover the position and try something else and still retain the confidence of the parties.
Okay, so
that's very different from not experimenting.
Yeah.
I don't think clients would want us to use the word experiment when we're talking about, but the reality is, even if we're not experimenting, we're constantly making judgment calls in every situation. What's going to work? What won't work? I'll try this and see what happens.
I think rather than experimenting, I think we call it flexibility, maybe.
Thank you. That's the euphemism I was struggling for.
So let's say you've gone down, you've taken some parties down a dead end.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you recover? What's your thought process? How do you articulate in a way that is transparent, but also it still instills confidence in the parties? What's your thought process, and what do you say that communicates that?
Yeah. I think it's easier if parties understand why you're trying to do what you're doing.
Okay.
So if you say, for example, I don't know, I'd like to have a meeting involving this person and that person and this person, and take them out from their particular teams, then I think giving some understanding to them of why you think that's important and what you think it might achieve is important.
Okay.
That's the first thing. And the second thing, I think, is in saying, look, there are a number of things we could do in this process. Some of them are going to be more effective than others, and we need, if we can, to work our way through to the ones that are more likely to be effective. I don't know in advance which those are going to be.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which one is conveying both, at the same time, both confidence and a sense of leadership, but also a sense of agnosticism, not quite knowing. And I think if you can convey those as normal rather than as abnormal, then I think you've gone a long way towards it. I think it's when people feel that something's going on in a mediation that is abnormal as opposed to difficult that they would lose confidence. Lots of things happen that are difficult. Doesn't mean they're abnormal or that the whole thing's coming off the rails.
I mean, I've noticed you've used the word leadership a couple of times. And I mean, it's the first time I've thought, it's genuinely the first time I've thought of leadership in the context of mediation and the mediator having to provide that sort of leadership. What do you mean? Help me understand what you mean by leadership.
It may or may not be the right word, but let me go with it for a bit. I think for anyone who hires somebody, if I hire a plumber, I expect them to have their own pretty clear set of expertise and views on what to do. Otherwise, why have I asked them to plumb my sink in? I also expect them to work with me in terms of how it's going to work, the aesthetics of it. I have to say I've never used the analogy of a plumber for mediators before, so we'll see where this one goes. This may bomb, crash and burn in a few minutes, but there is a sense in which in hiring someone, we rely on their expertise and contribution, but we expect them to work in tandem with us. Same for a mediator. No point hiring a mediator, and I've hired one or two in my time as well as been a mediator. No point hiring a mediator if you're simply going to ignore their perspective, their views on how it should be done, their expertise, their detachment, and so on. Equally, there's no point being a mediator if you're simply going to roll up and demand that we do X, Y, and Z, irrespective of what everybody else thinks. Okay. So that I'm not sure if leadership is the right word, but I think there's a sense of having one's own valuable contribution to make as a mediator. You're not just there to be a pinball bouncing between parties. There's a sense in which you've got your own perspective, your own drive, your own sense of direction that would be valuable. It doesn't mean you can force people there, but it does mean that it's an important perspective. Yeah. And I think that probably qualifies as leadership, although it's not maybe a traditional use of the word.
Yeah, no, I like it. I mean, I tell you why I like it. At first I thought, leadership from the autocratic sense, but actually that's not where you're coming from. It's more of a kind of the inner strength, the courage of one's conviction, to follow what we believe is important.
Yeah, and I think it classically comes home to roost where you think that you as a mediator think that a particular way forward is important in this mediation. Yeah. And it's going to be difficult, probably quite contentious. And then I think the willingness to say to the parties, I think we should do X. I can't force you to, but I strongly, strongly think we should do X. These are the reasons why I think we should do X. This is what I think we could achieve. But you need to buy into that as well. I'm not going to force you to. I think that sense of vision and direction is critically important. And I found that particularly in some of the much more drawn-out religious conflicts that I'm currently involved in, where to meet the other side across the divide is a huge risk. And so if I'm going to be involved and say I think the time has come for that meeting, I'm going out on a significant limb as a mediator. It's not a decision I take in the sense of foisting it onto them, but I think it is an act of leadership where I'm saying to them, you've hired me, you've got me involved in this. There's no point me being involved if I don't give you my perspective. And it seems to me as the mediator that this would be the next appropriate move. Will you go with that? Yes, we can talk about the risks, we can talk about the dangers and all the rest of it. But in the end, yes, I'm inviting you down this path.
Yeah. Okay. Thinking about managing expectations of clients then, how, and we talked about this briefly in our sort of pre-interview conversation.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've noticed through a number of conversations recently with experienced mediators like your good self, how they're almost becoming really creative around the process. So they've done away with the expectation that we sit around the table and we conclude matters by 5:30. But actually they listen more to the needs, take into account all the different variables and the needs of the parties, and design a process that's really flexible, that deviates from the tried and tested traditional, what we would consider the traditional sort of mediation format. But it's, they go off and have maybe a series of 3-hour sessions over a period of time, incorporated with Skype mediation, all sorts, conversations, and it got me thinking. I wonder how how much as mediators we should be thinking more creatively around that, how we engage people in different ways rather than churning out the same old.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're really touching on a concern I've had about the training of mediators for some time, and that is that I think we train a process rather than a series of understandings. So if and thereby we run the risk of becoming a slave to the process instead of being able to use a process to fit whatever is our understanding of conflict, the conflict at that particular time. So an example, what would be an example? Well, if what we're trying to, if one of the things we're trying to produce in a mediation is an opportunity for a more effective engagement between the parties, then the question naturally follows, how do you do that? In what context are they most likely to engage? So rather than necessarily leading you into a preordained model where, you start with some kind of joint meeting and then you separate and blah, blah, blah. The question is not what is the model or what is the process that's been modeled, but what is the need here? What needs to happen involving these individuals in order to make progress? And that may take you down the same process path, or it may take you down a completely different one. And so my concern about the training is that we've taught a kind of vanilla process and haven't taught enough of an understanding of conflict and how it operates on people so that mediators can make more informed decisions about process and take responsibility for them.
Yeah.
That said, and there's always going to be a that said, I suspect, the process can serve people very well. I'm actually not knocking the kind of processes that are taught at all. I'm simply saying that to teach the process on its own is not enough. You need to teach people why they might do X or Y or Z so that people can make informed choices about whether to do that, rather than simply teaching this is what you do next.
Yes.
And that may be an unfair caricature of many of the training courses. I teach some advanced mediation, but I don't teach, haven't for nearly 10 years taught any sort of basic mediation courses. So maybe they've moved on since I was involved.
Let's hope so.
Or maybe not.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I remember, I mean, I do more group facilitation than I do mediation, and I discovered a methodology for working with groups which has now informed the way I mediate. But the way I discovered this was through experience. I did a mediation for a client, and it went very, very well. They got me back and said, "Look, we've got a conflict with our board. I was thinking, could you come in and mediate for us?" So I said, sure thing. So I designed, I tried to retrofit what the mediation process as I knew it into a context, into a conflict and it didn't go well. didn't go as well as I'd hoped.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time thinking, how come it didn't work? And from that point, I've been searching for a methodology to work with groups that isn't a process, but is just and I talked about the kind of, my true north. I've kind of discovered a true north that, regardless of where I am in a conversation or when I'm working with a group, when I'm mediating, I refer to these core values that help me make a choice about what I do next, how I intervene, what I say next. And that's been incredibly valuable to me. And learning the process, I think, was maybe a good start. But I did feel constrained by that process, and also I unwittingly creating some expectations with clients and customers about the process. So now, educating a market in a process that actually may or may not work for them.
Exactly.
So, and I wonder how much how much latitude do we have as mediators to be creative and innovative in the way we go about our work?
Oh, look, I think we have immense flexibility. I think we have as much flexibility as we have imagination and courage. And that's not to say one can impose it on others, but I find when I'm with people who've hired me, so they've got an expectation that I have something to offer. Once I've got to a point where there's a level of trust that's been built, if I say, look, it seems to me that we should probably do X next, what do you think? Most of the time they'll say, okay, let's try it. And it's not that, I would couch it by, as I said earlier, by saying this is why, this is what I'd hope to achieve, and there are no guarantees in life. But I find a considerable willingness to go with that if you're prepared to invest time building a relationship with parties. And that for me is, if I was training mediators, I think in a way, other than the process, I would want to start by saying, how do you build relationships with newcomers, strangers, in a short space of time, so that they will invest a very substantial degree of trust in you? Because the answer to that question is probably the answer to how you go about the early stages of a mediation. But again, you see, it's approaching it the other way. It's not saying here's the process. It's saying here's what we need to achieve. I wonder what process might help us travel in that direction.
Very interesting. I loved your choice of words, kind of combining flexibility with imagination and courage. I think if I'm thinking of, qualities of a mediator, certainly those would stand out to me.
Yeah. Well, I think courage has become, in my mind, and I'm not saying I always possess it, but in my mind has become more and more and more important the longer I've mediated. Because by definition, those who come to us are stuck. And by definition, the route out of it is probably not going to be an easy one. Otherwise, they wouldn't have come to us. They'd have found it for themselves. So if they're going to come to us and work with us, it's going to require substantial courage on their part and on the mediator's part. And I think, going right back to the beginning of our conversation, I said something about setting expectations. You called it naming the elephant in the room. I think the subtext of explaining to people the kind of reality, well, not explaining really, but identifying the realities of where they find themselves, the subtext of that really is it's going to be difficult, and by definition it's going to require some hard work and some courage. And that's, in a sense, subliminally appealing to the best in people, which I think is, and maybe that's part of leadership as well, is about conveying to them however you do it, through language or whatever, conveying to them the belief that no matter how difficult the situation they find themselves in, they not me, they will be capable of finding a way forward. And if one can convey a belief in their own capacity and courage and imagination, just through the way you relate to them, then I think people will often live up to what is expected of them, rather than live down to whatever is expected of them. So I think, there are mediators who I know who set quite strict ground rules at the beginning about not interrupting each other and all this kind of stuff. That's fine, I'm not knocking it. I would never do it, actually, because what I want to do is appeal to the best in people, rather than have to discipline, as it were, what I assume might be the worst in them.
Okay, so again, it's thinking about the expectations that you set at the start of a mediation and how you go about setting those expectations. So maybe you aren't explicit in the expectations, but maybe you don't need to be explicit. Maybe implied in talking to the courage within that individual, in speaking to that part of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in speaking to the part of, the compassion within someone, tapping
Yes,
into that, implicit in that is, how one should conduct oneself in a conversation.
I agree. Absolutely.
Okay. I started this interview with the intent to see whether we could and should be more innovative with the process of mediation. And I think I learned something a bit deeper, and that's who I need to be when I'm mediating. I need to be the calm in the storm, as Bill said, the non-anxious presence. And I need to have courage, flexibility, and imagination to help parties make good settlement decisions. But the big takeaway for me is leadership. I wasn't familiar with that term in the context of mediation, but I think I need to demonstrate leadership and be able to instill a belief in parties that regardless of the difficulties they might be experiencing, they will be capable of finding a way forward. Inspiring stuff, Bill. Thank you. All right, so remember to check in and watch the second part of this interview. How do you carve your own path, create your own mediation success story, and mediate on a more regular basis? All of this and more in part 2.